So we're launching right at the hour. Behold, there we go. Our patrons who are helping the old RJ keep at it every week, and hopefully next week as well, depending upon whether I'm in Seattle or back here after Thanksgiving. We'll work that out, but fingers crossed we should be able to pull that off wherever we are. So we'll find out what's going on in there. As you may have been guessing, for the weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks we've been giving at this, replacing Darwin. Oh, Nathaniel Jensen is the gift that keeps on giving. It's just delightful. For those of you who have been keeping up what I've been dealing with, he likes his charts. Aren't they sweet? Linear progressions of all these little organisms that appear all so sweet in the world. Well, this one we got up here is our friends, the down there, one down below. There we go. The salamanders. He's actually got, for a change, more than one salamander group. So we've got that, and then we've got this little puppy in here. The chart looks very, very similar. Salamanders are an interesting group. They came up in book 1 of The Rocks Were There because they were we discussed their genetics in relation to orphan genes and how creationists have a problem dealing with all that little fiddly bit stuff. But that's not something Jensen deals with. He doesn't really go into any details on the bigger context. Hello, Command Cyborg. Welcome to the show. The salamanders have, they're actually commonly, when you look up salamanders, they're the Urodales, Urodeles, and they involve 10 different families, of which Jensen bumps into 2. Specifically the Asiatic Hynobideidae and the regular Salamandridae that includes the newts. You'll not be surprised that he doesn't offer any sources in his reference base for any of those, other than the data points that are buried in his footnotes that are drawing off of the genetic database. Ironically, though, he doesn't even bother to reference the baraminology paper Brophy and Kramer had done back in 2007 on a different group, the mole salamanders. Yes, you found this almost from the beginning for once. Yeah, hello. Which is curious that it wouldn't occur to him to actually draw upon the creationism on his own side on that. I don't know. Anyway, in that first family, the Asiatic ones, he shows about 33 species, and he has them appearing down to about 500 BCE. And then the second one has 27 dots. They are mainly after 1300 BC down to about 350 BC, which is into Hellenistic times. I'm suspecting that the reason why he does that is because salamanders were kind of noticed by a lot of ancient peoples, and they started figuring in a lot of mythological things. They got associated with magic fire, things where they supposedly appear out of fires and all that kind of stuff. Hi, Barbara. That's going to be discussed in volume 2, concerning how creationists have tried to transform salamanders into dragons. I wish I were making this up. But depictions in a lot of medieval art of salamanders, they decide are actually dragons. And we're talking potentially fire-breathing types, although the flying dragon bit is something that they're kind of more careful about how they stumble into, and they sort of drag in pterosaurs and all of this other stuff. But spoiler alert, they're not very coherent. I'll be getting to the various sources on the salamanders in a bit. We'll also mention part 2 of the show, which has to do with another one from Jensen, of which he has a thing on mitochondrial DNA and that riffs off of a 2015 paper about the human genome process. Supposedly, they found exactly 123 mutations that his model predicted for Noah's descendants. And Brian Thomas immediately pounced on that as, quote, a spectacular confirmation of Genesis history. The most diverse human mitochondrial DNA on record actually shows 123 differences. Dun, dun, dun. Not quite. The Lim paper, which I'll be putting the reference to, so you'll be able to link to it, had actually been about working out how big of a population sample you needed to have in order to isolate particular pathogenic mutations. And they had, quote, identified 6,100 single nucleotide variants, unquote, in that sample. And that 123 number represented something else completely different. It's, quote, the maximum number of pairwise nucleotide differences in the sample. So, yeah, a mess. A geneticist can go through and you can, Dan Stern Cardinale or somebody like that, who happens to catch on this, you can look at the Jensen account and then the Lim paper and see if there's any matchup at all on there. But back to our friendly little salamanders. They're a really interesting little bunch. There's a specific paper that relates to that first family group. Get my little notes up here so I can see them a little bit better for me. Boop, 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 boop. There we go. There's a paper from 2006 by Zhang on phylogeny, evolution, and biogeography of the Asiatic salamanders, which was in PNAS. And rather interestingly, some nice little graphics which have the chronology involved and boom, 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 the biogeography aspect of how they're spreading in Asia and India. They originated back in the mid-Cretaceous and they diversified after about 50 million years ago as India slammed into Asia. You want to guess how much of that biogeographical relationship in a flood context Jensen discusses? Or as far as I can tell, anywhere in the creationist literature, any of them have discussed? Crickets, which are insects, which are also not really discussed by creationists as well. It gets even more fun when you look at the other family. They're distinguished from the other salamanders by apparently lack of rib grooves and especially rough skin, which are festooned with poison glands, which would seem kind of a creepy thing to be designing, but that doesn't bother the creationists particularly, and needless to say, that isn't brought up anywhere in Jensen's analysis. They've got a nice little paper by Pyron, who sorts out the whole amphibia, and it's a long mother. Holy smokes, there's an awful lot of material in there in which the salamanders fit in. And that helps figure out also that chronology that's going back tens of millions of years. Remember, whatever the organism, he's taking the root of them in according to the standard evolutionary model and just simply compressing them by a technique that he does not go into the details on to get them down into that little flood frame. So theoretically, you could have organisms that originated 1 billion years ago and he would just go, they're all going to fit into his model because that's the only model that he allows. But it gets much more fun when we start looking at the fiddly bit details of that group. There was a 2012 paper by Gao and another one from 2020 by Schock and yet another one by 2022. Several of those are in, well, in fact, all three of them, I think, are in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they have an awful lot of interesting information. Fossils, a Triassic stem turtle. That's the 2020 paper, and it goes into some delicious details about the gradual acquisition of the features that are occurring in their ancestral groups, and then finally into the bodies of the familiar salamanders. Now, given the number of families that there are, how the hell, given how generally similar in the superficial way salamanders appear, why aren't they all a single kind? Why are they going at the family level That would involve detailed systematics, and the reason all those little fiddly bits, things like the vertebral central ossify early, or the parietal L shape and the squamosal is straight and blah, 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 all of that stuff that you'll be able to see in this particular paper are, in principle, diagnostic characteristics that, based on the morphology, they ultimately trace to genetic information and so forth. And so how come he isn't delineating all of that stuff and then applying it rigorously to anywhere else, or for that matter, any of the creationists that are dealing with it? We get into even more fun with another fossil from the 2022 paper. Middle Jurassic. This one, yes. Documents an early stage in salamander evolution. If anything, the difference between the older material from 10 years ago and this newer material is that they get even more specific on the details. So there's a quite detailed breakdown of the salamanders and their phylogeny, and even more examples of the diagnostic characteristics that our little salamanders are developing over time. And are we going to be able to indicate what the created type looked like, what the genetics of it was, what its characteristics are? What was the one on the ark? Have no clue from the creationist point of view. At no point in any of these baraminology papers that I've ever seen do they get into the fiddly bit details of applying their supposedly fantastically accurate model to account for the data field. You would think that anybody who dives into stuff, an example that I've mentioned in my older tip writing has to do with playing cards and the history of tarot. And Michael Dummett, who's a logician, is a big playing card groupie. And he wrote the book on the game of tarot, outlining all the examples of existing tarot decks that have been preserved over the years in various museums, and a complete breakdown of all the known tarot games known in the world, and they're spread around through, eventually down into the Austro-Hungarian Empire and other stuff that go off into broad different areas, and why and their lack of things in certain other areas. And that's because anybody that's really interested in a topic and they know it well wants to account for all the data. So this great big thick book, by the way, considerably thicker than anything that Jensen has produced, on just the format and structure of the tarots. How come the creationists can't do that with their model? That they would really dive in and love to explain every little fiddly bit and account for why this little thing indicates that this is the initial state of the kind, and then these things are the things that are developing. Why aren't they diving into all of that? Because their model doesn't explain anything. It only explains stuff away. It's just a complete washout mess. It is kind of handy, however, for Jensen to have gone into the relatively small number of examples that he does in his book. And there's still, let me see, how many pages do we still have left before he runs out? But, oops. I think I dropped my poor little Wi-Fi. It seems to be all right. Let's see how far we got going in here. We've got eels next week. And then we got the sharks, and then zebras and the horses at the end of things. And at that point, we're back into the gradation of footnotes and the dregs as we get towards the tail end of the chapter. So I've only got a little bit to go on the last of his charts. It is such a sparse analysis of, in every single instance, he's picked on a family and made no indication of whether or not there might be boundary layers which might spill over into another family, which by the baraminological point of view would be suggesting one kind can turn into another, or laying out the criteria why that wouldn't be the case. Every one of these charts ultimately rests upon functionally a standard phylogenetic system that's not developed by him, but is generated by the data field that the actual geneticists are dealing with, and buried in that is an order of appearance that is determined by their genetics that implicitly is dictating what the primary form of the organism is. And then he has to deal, or ought to be dealing, with how much of that variation could in fact generate that fast. And does he have any indication for any one of those families that he deals with that actually has happened? Doesn't occur to him that he needs to do that. And that's because this book was never really intended as anything that's going to be persuading secular scientists, particularly the people who are generating the genetic data that he's riffing off of. It's intended as an apologetic argument to reinforce the happy land of creationism. Now, once we get through with replacing Darwin, I've managed to acquire a copy of his traced book, which other people have also made note of. Dan Stern Cardinale has already mentioned examples of it, and substantial parts of traced have been dumped on by Robert Carter, the creationist geneticist, saying, oh, no, Jensen, you're going a little too far on this. You're making claims that aren't fitting in with the facts. And precisely because his utilization of the data field forces him to put some groupings so preposterously recent that they're stumbling over the fact that they're not fitting in with what we can observe within a frame that even the creationists accept is functionally datable, even by radiocarbon dating. And that's basically the period from 1500 BC on down. You know, the creationists are very well, functionally, the creationists have to dig their heels in for anything going back beyond 2350 BCE, which is the flood. And Jensen, in fact, pointedly does a thing with Ken Ham, where he comes up with this cockamamie little calibrator thing that allows him to somehow compress radiocarbon dates earlier than the flood zone, and then treat them normally from stuff on, because otherwise they're bumping into things where they're getting radiocarbon dating of settlements in the early kingdom, the period around with King David and all of that. So it's a hilarious double standard that goes on in there. And a lot of that won't really be coming up in the venue of Roxford there, because we're dealing with the scientific and evolutionary angle, but it will be relevant in future works that are going to be delving into the history of religions in general and how the biblical worldview has come about and how they deal with data and how various ones fiddle with it. These are issues that probably would arise just as readily with other religions if they played the game very much. If they had written documents, for example, many religions don't have a written record. And Native American cultures and a lot of tribal cultures really don't have, other than just a more recent ethnographic thing that is told to anthropologists, or for that matter, passing missionaries, rather than having a fixed written document like the Bible or the Mahabharata. Yes, it's the good old Aristotle. He could be fun. The educated differ from the uneducated as much as the living from the dead. Although it should be pointed out, so much of what Aristotle thought he knew wasn't. It was a very bright mind and a very inventive guy, and tutored Alexander the Great, as I recall. And but like a lot of the Greeks, they did more thought experiments in their head than physical experiments. And that was one of the reasons why Greek science never quite developed, even though there were certainly people there who were as ingenious as anybody that would be living in the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. But a whole network of education and social mobility and breakdown of systems of property ownership and things generated a whole cascade of processes that unleashed the imagination of people in a way that wasn't happening in the Greek and Roman times. Yes, a man of his time. Yeah. As a thought experiment, it would be fascinating to to pick some of the great proto-scientists of history and imagine sucking them in with a time machine and bringing them to our world and explain to them what we know about the universe and its age and what things are made of and what goes on inside of our bodies and all that stuff, and see how many of them go, wow, that's neat, versus, no, 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 don't tell me that. That can't be true. Oh, I found that I was much better at getting good Wi-Fi connections in the wee hours of the morning. I work as a late night owl in general anyway. I typically don't go to bed until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. During the summertime, it may go to the point where I go, oh, the sun is coming up, I better get to bed. So I keep vampire hours. But there was a practical application. I tried to do the show at the 7 p.m. Wednesday period, but everybody and his brother is on Twitter and YouTube and all the social media. It's a crowded field. And I was discovering that I just had a devil of a time getting good connections that way, where I found out, who the hell is up at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday? Everybody's in bed like God-fearing people should be. So it turned out to be a nice little opportunity. And since anybody can watch the videos at any time they want, they don't have to depend on it. And since a bunch of the folk are in different time zones, I mean, Ian Chen is in Australia, and so they're in a completely different operation. Oh, if you don't care about Hunter, how many times do we have to tell? Oh, I am afraid very little penetrates the head of Kathy McMorris Rogers. She will go for all of that stuff in the same way that she neglected to vote for Donald Trump's impeachment even the second time. And she's wiffle-waffly on that matter in general. So she'll go right down the gangplank on that one. What I think will be interesting to watch from a methods point of view will be to see how any hearings that they do will have to have some Democrats on it. They may grump and be very picky about who they want to get on there, but there's going to have to be some bipartisanship on these kind of hearings. And we'll be able to see how Republicans function as interrogators, what obsessions they've got. As far as I can tell with Hunter Biden, that the thing the Justice Department was looking into, apparently there was some dicey things about how he disposed of a gun, and another issue that he may or may not have accurately reported income that he was filing on his tax returns, involving, by Trump standards, pocket change. I don't know of anything else on the supposed Hunter laptop, which, what I think an indication of how flimsy the thing is. And there was a recent report that the Republicans spewed out. Jim Jordan and that was touting it, and it's downloadable online because there are employees, so they have to make these things available. That basically looks like a pile up of press releases from these various congressmen and senators on this, and whether or not they have anything beyond that is very problematic, because why wouldn't they be calling attention to it already? Instead, they've just hinted, ooh, the laptop. Ooh, there's stuff on the laptop. Yes, we'll find out where Judge Crater is. That's a really old joke. 1930. Getting on to the subject, do ICs not know that too much or too little genetic material is harmful? Oh, no, they haven't quite caught up on that little memo yet. Remember, relatively few of them are in fact geneticists, and the ones who are, Sanford is a plant geneticist, so he's not really used to dealing with like people, and Jensen and Tompkins both run in the peripheral area, and Carter. Those are their 4 big geneticists, and as we can see from their own published works, as we can see from their own published material, they just wiffle waffle around the data field on there. But in principle, the creation model, if it were valid, would imply that they could retro calculate what the original created kinds are for any extant examples of kinds. So they would be able to theoretically tell us what Adam and Eve's genome looked like. And although they may blither blather about created heterozygosity and polyploidy and all of these other buzzwords that they fit around with, it never gets to the stage where they're talking about specific haplotypes and specific gene frequencies and so forth and so on for the supposed created kind. And because this is all this is a sort of Damocles that's hanging over their head for every organism. Because remember, forget the flood. Every organism on the planet comes in their model from created kinds that were created only 6,000 years ago. And all of them 6,000 years ago. Because in their model, all creation occurred during the creation week, period, full stop. And no creationing was done after that. So the little critters knocking around in the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve bunch, that's the whole shebang for the created organisms. And then you move along, because when you get down to the flood, they get their second bottleneck. And a few creationists are aware that there's difficulties they got to deal with, but they're so far away from working out the details of it that I don't anticipate anybody is going to be able to come up with this. And that is that all those little created kinds that were in Eden, in the space of about 1,000 years or so, have to generate all of the ones that show up in the fossil record. Although we now get into another conundrum, there are fossils that are Cretaceous earlier, and then there are fossils, largely mammals, post-Cretaceous. And the traditional position of creationists is that the flood boundary layer is that Cretaceous boundary. So Precambrian rocks are created weak, and then from the Paleozoic down in through the Mesozoic, that's the flood, all lickety-split, hundreds of millions of years stuff into like a year or two. And then an ice age happened and all that kind of stuff. But there's a small body, and we're going to be alluding to it more in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. And Joel Duff has called attention to this, and others will be alluding all of that. That there's a block of, not a hell of a lot, maybe half a dozen people, almost entirely at the Institute for Creation Research. And so you find it in the Acts and Facts articles and the various works that they do on their websites. They want to ease it down past the Cretaceous and sometimes way down into the Pleistocene, and I can see the attraction of it, because an awful lot of fossil data, including the Green River Formation, and which is often discussed in creationist apologetics, and they imply that's from the flood. There doesn't seem to be anything obviously different between the fossilization thing that's going on post-Cretaceous and prior to Cretaceous. And so the fact that you see fossils in the more recent time frames suggests, well, same causations. And so if one's going to be delivered to the flood, they got to do it with the other. This has not gone over a hell of a lot amongst people outside of that Tim Clary set and the ones hanging around that at ICR. And it's going to be funky to see how that works out. But anyway, back to the flood conundrum. So you've got all of that super speciation going on from the hypothetical kinds that only existed 6,000 years ago, and therefore you should theoretically be able to work out what their genomes in that were. All of that's doing lickety-split, and then the flood comes along, swashes everything in. 1,500 kinds, if you move over to Answers in Genesis land with the Ark encounter, are aboard the Ark. That preserves the land critters and all the rest, and of which half of them drop dead in the post-flood period by their own measure, 54%, most of them. So the Ark was a piss-poor bad operation when it come to preserving everything. But now we're facing bottleneck number 2, because only those kinds on the Ark have to proliferate all of the existing species in how long? 500, 1,000-ish years, depending on the look at the Jensen sliding scales that we've been seeing, chart after chart after chart. And it's just wacky and hilarious. Needless to say, all those insects and all the aquatic creatures and fish and invertebrates theoretically were created weak kinds too, and any of their speciation and their fossil record would be subject to exactly the same scriptures. And yet, whoop, they're pretty much off the field. Now, you got to admit, it's a daunting task to think of going through the 20, oh God, I think it's way more than 20 families of ants. I know there's something on the order of 20,000 species of ants, and there's a comparable number in wasps and other bees. And then, of course, you got the 500,000 species of beetles and all of that. Oh, that's and then, of course, all the little microscopic-y things, nematodes and chinorynchs and all the other little critters, you know, creation week for them too. And so you tend to get, when you have apologetics that deal with this at all, is they tend to focus in on Lisa for Truth. Sorry, I'm responding to Ham. Are you in communication with Mr. Ham? Oh, my condolences. Ham is kind of an interesting little character from, remember, he is a preacher, not somebody with a scientific training. And I've seen no indication that he really pays all that much attention to what his operation does at apologetic level. I mean, he does shows every once in a while. He pops in like the God King coming in to bless the natives with not Ann Gager, Georgia Purdom and Country, or on my channel personally, yeah. Ham, of course, is carrying water for a particular subset of creationists, the Answers in Genesis group, which, as we've already noted, doesn't have identical views on a lot of the fiddly bit details. For example, AIG is pretty okay with natural selection being a thing that can operate within a kind, whereas Randy Gugliuzza, the now head of the ICR operation, just can't stand it. And so he comes up with this creative environmental tracking, something like that. Continuous environmental tracking, CET. We'll be alluding to that in the new book and that as well. And Tompkins is even, I think it's either Tompkins or Jensen, is kind of flirting with that little idea too. But one of them, Jason Lyle, however, who is an astrophysicist, so is, but he didn't buy into that. And he reached the point where he left, cut his connections with ICR because he just couldn't buy into that anymore. So the issue about how often the different creationist groups up at the top, which is, you have one block at the Creation Ministries International, which is the section of AIG that split off when they had their squabbles with Ham over finances back in 2005, somewhere around in there. And then, of course, you have ICR operating in its little niche. And then below them, you've got that seething mass of the Kent Hovians and the Walt Browns and the Don Battens and all of that running around the basements. Oh, yeah, CET is. Yeah, that's continuous environmental tracking is the idea that organisms have designed in them these intrinsic, like coiled spring feedback loop computer programs. That's his analogy. That allow the organisms to adapt very, very fast, and that it's not external natural selection that is deciding which lives or dies, but these internal structures that were designed in by the creator. It's a cockamamie mess, and it involves mangling technical literature that they bump into. And Joel Duff has commented on it. We'll be alluding to some of the specific papers. And Dan Stern Cardinale has also pointed out stuff that there's a famous experiment that was done back in like the 1940s on some bacteria that completely blew that argument to smithereens at the base level. So it's just a non-starter. And it doesn't look like CET is going to be finding much traction anywhere else. So it's a thing that will pretty much, well, not quite like punctuated equilibrium is a very different kind of thing. And in fact, punctuated equilibrium isn't really running typically at the genetic level. For those, it in some respects is controversial and non-controversial, because some will apply punctuated equilibrium to things other than species, which was what the original topic was. But the idea in its base form is that Gould and Eldritch were applying the speciation concepts of allopatric speciation, which is speciation by geographic range, rather than sympatric, where A turns into B over time and A has disappeared because it's B now. Kind of all in one place evolution, which to some extent is what Darwin got saddled with, even though he actually recognized both ways of looking at it. If you look at how allopatric speciation by branching over a long range to where A and B can continue to exist, and then if A dies out and B moves into the same area, it looks like that A is suddenly popped up and turned into B, when in fact it was a process going on in different areas, not the ones that you're seeing in the actual fossil bed. So it was applying Ernst Mayr's allopatric speciation ideas to the jumpiness that you were observing in the not fine grained fossil record. Now, where you have very detailed fossil record, like foraminifera raining down their little dead bodies, their shell casings by the millions, over millions of years, they can see much finer gradation in terms of speciation process. And it turns out that they can sometimes see gradual A into B, and sometimes a punctuated jump from a B to A to a replacement group. And in the same species. There's one example that was known, I think Globulina or something like that, where one group was doing a one mode in the tropics and another one in the temperate group went in a different direction. So you had several different speciation events coming from a single root species. Who is this? Yes, who is this Patrick involved in this evolution? Yes, and he became a saint. And it's the saint, the patron saint of getting drunk and running around with green on you. I think that's what it is, and that connects us up then to verdant, and we could probably word association and make our own religion that way. I think we've got. I've already have a name for it: omni non-directionalism. That would be the philosophy of life that I would like to promote. So, anyway. Punctuated equilibrium tends to get dumped on by anti-evolutionists because they just say, oh, they're trying to rationalize the stasis in the fossil record. And even Gould wasn't going that far on it. If it was being treated, you would find people arguing about the Cambrian explosion and a whole bunch of other stuff that Gould was not talking about at all. He wrote a whole book on the subject. And you find punctuated equilibrium concepts popping up still in the regular scientific literature. And in some respects, in that sense, it's not terribly controversial because it's simply a statement of the obvious that some things run with allopatric speciation and some things run with sympatric. Sympatric things are a little more common in invertebrates, where vertebrates have this tendency to be allopatric in nature, where ring species are a classic example of things where the range has increased so much that you have groups that won't interbreed with each other, which is another element that Mayr brought into the case, which was the idea that speciation involves isolation to where they don't easily interbreed anymore. Now, we know that a lot of species, again, violate that principle in the fact that you've got hybridization that can go on. Ducks and a lot of animals do it relatively easily. There are even examples from quite widely varied groups in fish that are able to hybridize, which there was some recent material done on. And then you have to eat a 4-leaf clover every 7th Saturday in May. Yes, there we go. Yeah. January, February, March, April, May. Anyway, I did a whole thing on PunkEek in my old tip website, which is still hanging around in there. Take a look at it. That went into, I still keep track of the issue. It was one of my first analyses that I did about how creationists don't understand certain things. And so I really started keeping track of every instance of where an anti-evolutionist was bringing up punctuated equilibrium. And it's just hilarious how completely disconnected from the actual concepts an awful lot of them are. Some of them will even describe it halfway decently, but then they jump off the cliff and they think, I've seen creationists who say that punctuated equilibrium requires tens of thousands of mutations to appear all at once. Nope. Sorry. Nope. No. In fact, one of the things that would be the case in speciation is that for all practical purposes, speciation doesn't ever involve lots of mutations, because the speciation event involves organism A and the new species is almost identical to organism A. And so there's not a gigantic amount of shifting going on. Sometimes you can have speciation without any genetic change at all. Epigenetic flips as to when certain sex pheromones are functioning in insects, to where they're suddenly breeding at a different time of day. And genetically, there's virtually no difference between them. So anyway, Lisa, do they understand anything? Not really. Not at any fundamental level. And it's understandable, not excusable, but understandable. Why? Because they're missing most of the data field. And that's the other little thing that my little tip project has done that I think is kind of a neat accomplishment. And that is that I'm measuring source by source exactly how many anti-evolution regular science citations are done by anti-evolutionists. And so I'll remind you about the basic numbers. At the moment, I have a track of about 11,000 anti-evolution works that stretch over many, many decades. And of those, all together, they've cited something on the order of 6,500 sources. Now, there are still a bunch of I have a whole stack of creationist technical literature that's got a bunch. Michael Ord and John Woodmarap and Sanford and Andrew Snelling and others, when they get in a technical mood, can have just a lot of source citations in a particular paper, a lot of which will be obsolete older material, some of it which is stuff they've cited over and over and over again. And I gradually encounter that as I process it. At the moment, on the work that I've been doing on Acts and Facts to bring that up to speed to 2022 for the volume 2 of the Rocks Were There, I'm going through them and all of the technical citations they're doing. I figure it makes more sense to deal with the more recent material rather than the older material. So I gradually get through the older stuff. Anyway, that's 6,500 sources has to be compared with the data field that I have in currently of the technical literature, which is a little bit more than 30,000 technical papers. So that means that all told, the entire anti-evolution corpus is bumping into about 20% of my data field. Now, that 30,000 sources is not the complete science literature. It's just what I've managed to encounter that's relevant to the analysis of their 6,500. And a big chunk of the 6,500, if you look, one of the reasons why I'm doing analyses like this is to measure their source usage. So of the 150 or so technical papers that are cited by Jensen in his book, he's misrepresenting about half of them. And Rupin Sanford, the previous one that I had done an analysis of, also was misrepresenting about half of the source citations they were dealing with. And they were authority quoting things out of context. They were stumbling over material that they're overlooking content that conflicts with their argument, and they're not mentioning it. The one difference between Rupin Sanford and Jensen is that Rupin Sanford were heavily addicted to authority quoting, of which something like half of their works were used for authority quoting purposes. Whereas Jensen doesn't do that at all much. I think there's only a couple examples where he's really authority quoting somebody, and all the rest of it is dangling the source citation to buttress a position. But as you've been seeing in this show, time and time again, when you look up the original source material, you discover that it's not helping his case, and the salamanders is just the latest little bit. So A lot of that material then we'll be alluding to in the appendix that's going to go in the new book on the arc encounter and their listing of kinds, because it'll be interesting to compare what percentage of the kinds in the arc encounter are even addressed by Jensen, and why does he pick the ones that he does? Why are they? Because they've got a relatively small number of species that he can tackle? Does he tend to avoid ones with lots and lots of species? The only way we can look at that is to be able to look at the whole boundary layer as to what the kinds are in relationship to all the families and that. So there'll be a lot of fun and games that we'll be having, and some neat little chart breakdowns of their listing, and a listing in alphabetical order, and then a breakdown by the various forms to find out why they're in the order that they are in the arc encounter listing. And my suspicion is they're simply copying the sequence in regular systematics. So they're being hidden parasites in the order of that they're presenting it. And that they don't even have a baromenology structure. Why wouldn't you just put all the damn kinds up in alphabetical order? Since they're all separately created, there's no connection between any of them. That's because they form nested groups to where there's all the dinosaurs are together, and all the amphibians are together, and all the mammals are together. So there's a nested hierarchy that is there because there is an evolutionary relationship to it that they aren't acknowledging, because all they're doing is just siphoning off the upper level of things. The amphibians will be a particularly funny one, because an awful lot of the amphibian groups have very not speciose families. So that there's a whole bunch of frogs, for example, that are sufficiently oddball that they have their own separate family in normal systematics, but there's only like one or two species known. And so that's giving us clues about how when you start looking at the larger systematic issues, that families can originate, especially in groups that have been around for a really long time, out of previous families. And it'd be nice if you had a super duper fabulous fossil record. Of course, when we do come up with some of the stuff, you can see the great gradual changes and things that are going on over time. But of course, the creationist doesn't discuss that. So they just bypass all of this material. This will come in spades with the human evolution issue. And Erica, dear sweet Gutsick Gibbon, has been doing a breakdown of Rupin Sanford's book from her perspective, because paleoanthropology is her gig. That's her career. She's studying it at a detail level. And she is looking at their misrepresentation of source material, gobsmackingly stupid mistakes, blatant ignoring of content that I didn't even spot when I was looking through the material, because I didn't have the trained eye of somebody who can spot the little sidebar details in relation to systematics and skull sutures and all the other kind of fun games. So you can tell a cat's a cat. Yes, indeed. You can tell a cat's a cat, but the question is a myacid a cat, or is a myacid a dog? The myasids are among those various groups that are the intermediate forms, the transitional groups from which the cats and dogs, canines and felines developed over a very long period of time. Spoiler alert, creationists don't discuss myasids very often. They bump into some occasionally, and in fact you get a whole bunch of issues that pop up. One of the ones that's going to be a topic in one of the future books relation to climate science, creationists, particularly at ICR, are really climate science deniers, and it's a funky little thing to go on. But there's one case where they were talking about the adaptive features of fish, that it was basically in the gee whiz category. Ooh, see how magnificent the designer was to create this little adaptive feature in fish. But the paper was actually about the stress that fish can go through in a changing environment, and the threats of climate change. So even when they were stumbling into issues of climate science, the light bulb or gas lamp or oil lamp doesn't quite go off on their head. What about hyenas? Hyenas. Oh, yes, dear sweet hyenas. Yeah, all those little butch. I think, what did somebody describe them all as very angry dykes among the very, very and false weird genitalia things that developed. Gould did some stuff writing about all that weird stuff. Excellent bone crushing teeth, by the way, and pack hunters, and often get into fights with lions and vultures as to who gets to play with the carrion. But yeah, that's the whole groups of civets, and there's a whole broad range of them that regular systematics, if they label them as a family, and I mentioned a couple of weeks ago this one group of animals that the only reason why Jensen is listing it as a kind is because the systematics had advanced and they split off one family into a subset as a separate family in the 1980s. And that's because the systematics gets better and we know more genetic information and we have a broader data field. But no recognition whatsoever on that. Why was he not using the older version as a kind? What criteria would he use to be able to accept that newer version as a kind? Oh, it's just chaos. It's a mess. Although I think either Tompkins or Jensen in one of the 2020 Acts and Facts I'm going through does a whole article on how the New Testament agrees that about the nature of kinds, like that matters. Like anybody gives a shit as to whether or not they can somehow make the New Testament make any sense in terms of systematics. So it's religion, and it's never going to be anything other than religion, and it's never going to make any headway whatsoever. I don't see the slightest inkling that anybody that does regular cladistic systematics is paying even the slightest attention to anything that these baraminologists are doing, and never will, because there's no good model on it. So anyway, we're getting close to the end of the hour here. I think, as I said, I'll hopefully we'll have a regular show on next week at the same time. If it turns out that I'm on the road or connections aren't doing well or whatever, then I'll have to postpone things till the week after that, but there will be a next episode. But cross fingers, same time, same channel, and everybody have a nice Thanksgiving. And then, of course, we all get to gear up for the Christmas holidays and for gift giving. And for those of you wanting gifts, might I suggest the books. Evolution Slam Dunk, Volume 2 will be on the way probably next year. Rocks Were There, Volume 2. Evolution Slam Dunk on the reptile-mammal transition, and the 2 Phileas Fogg novels that are out. So you can visit all the wonderful world of 1872 and 1876 and all these other places, and see the sights and go on adventures and fly in amazing flying machines and see death rays at work and all sorts of exciting things that are going on, and even find out where you can get popcorn at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. Nice, dripping with butter. So anyway, well, and Lisa, you can get the books for yourself. Occupy the time reading on there. Hopefully I'll be able to get another Fogg novel out in another couple of years. And of course, we'll be getting Volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. And then Jackson and I have a couple books beyond that. And then there's also the Coulter Camp book, which is about the history of creationism and their attempts to take over education. And so the old fart RJ is going to be busy for a long time to come. I'm going to keep at it as long as I can. So everybody, yes, yeah, that's true. Although there are a few wacky, very typically conservative Orthodox Jews who functionally would be classified as creationists, and hyper-conservatives and all that, which is the generally defining feature of anti-evolutionism. It's really hard to find a not conservative anti-evolutionist. In fact, other than William Jennings Bryan from 100 years ago, who had it from the angst over the First World War angle. Otherwise, politically, he was like a Bernie Sanders type. And he stands out as very atypical in that regard. Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council and that type, if you look at the politics of Kent Hovind, he makes Attila the Hun seem like a liberal. So anyway, and developed the space lasers, yes. Yes, yeah. Marjorie Taylor Greene got reelected. She's going to be, and Lauren Boebert apparently is still going to be in there. And so we got and Matt Getz and a lot of these other Looney Tunes, and they're going to be making a nuisance for them. But they are our employees, and so I feel perfectly obliged on Twitter to call attention to their stupidness. Although, as typical of creationists, the Trumpistas are the same way. They don't pay the slightest attention to what anybody says. They're just spewing out the dogma and operating in there. It'd be nice if people would be asking more source methods questions, but I think the reason why they get elected is because their constituents aren't asking source methods questions either. So, yeah, so being in chats usually increases a person's reading speed. Yeah, well, that's an interesting. I have to process information as best I can do, and I think I've at least mastered the long tweet to get what I need in, and to be able to put in my links and stuff to be able to slam down. There was somebody that made a claim a couple days ago on Twitter. This shows how the methodology can be used to hopefully good effect. He made a bold claim, and it was some wacky little Trump politician that the fentanyl kills more people than COVID did. And I went, really? That's interesting. We have 1 million dead from COVID. How many from fentanyl? And so I pulled up some statistical information that suggests that since 1999 to the present, something on the order of 250,000 people have died from fentanyl, of which about half of that has been during the Trump administration, interestingly enough. And it's continuing to slightly rise. I think it's up to like 90 or quite a big chunk that have happened fairly recently. But nonetheless, that's way below the number of people that died in short order in the space of a year and a half under COVID. So what's extremely likely is that the person never even thought to check out what the facts were on this. He just found this information blip from somewhere, who knows, because he didn't offer any sources, and is never going to find any sources for it. And whether or not they'll go on and repeat it anyway, look at the number of times Dwayne Gish repeated the same claptrap over and over again, even when he was called out for it. And of course, Kent Hovind does exactly the same thing. So there's your methodology. So have a good time, find your love. We're all trying to do that. So see you next week or the week after, as the case may be. And happy Thanksgiving. And don't accept any wooden penguins, and stay safe, and don't get run over by an asteroid. So